On December 21st, 2019, a decision was made in Bolivia that would cost dozens of people their lives. In a small office, Dr. Freddie Time issued a medical certificate, a piece of paper seemingly harmless, but with devastating consequences. It certified that a convicted murderer had a number of illnesses: hepatomegaly, gastritis, diabetes, stomach ulcers, asthma, and even a supposedly life-threatening liver disease. The patient, Richard Choque Flores, convicted of kidnapping, rape, and murder. The certificate recommended his release on health grounds. 3 days later, shortly before Christmas, a judge accepted the bribe: $3,500 in cash and a bottle of whiskey, and the murderer was free again. No one could have guessed at the time that the most dangerous sex offender in recent Bolivian history was being released back into society. And no one knew how many lives this decision would cost. Because Richard's story did not begin on that December day, it had already left its first bloody traces years earlier. He was born in 1988 in El Alto, a city above La Paz, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters. His father was a police officer, his mother a teacher, a seemingly ordinary family. But when Richard was 4 years old, his father was shot and killed while on duty. This early trauma shaped him. He withdrew, began to show signs of unusual behavior, spoke hardly at all, and avoided other children. His mother tried to control him, but the facade of normality began to crumble. As a teenager, Richard attended a military school, but soon dropped out. He returned to the house he shared with his mother and sister, and there he transformed into something no one noticed. His social contacts were sparse, his behavior increasingly manipulative. He began spending time in online forums, using false identities, offering help, and taking advantage of every moment someone trusted him. The case of his younger cousin Fidel was particularly tragic. When Fidel wanted to apply to military school in 2011, Richard promised to help him, in exchange for a payment of $5,000. Fidel said goodbye to his mother, met with Richard, and disappeared without a trace. Years later, it emerged that he was one of the first documented victims. The list grew. In November 2013, law student Blanca Rubili Machi disappeared after meeting with a supposed university instructor, also Richard, under a false name. Days later, her body was found buried in a sack. Richard was arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison in 2015 without parole. And yet, on December 24, 2019, with a fake medical certificate and some cash, he was back on the streets. He returned to his family home, the very place where so many of his crimes had been committed. The neighbors had no idea, and Richard began killing again. No sooner was he free than Richard Choque Flores wasted no time. His methods were now more sophisticated, but the pattern remained the same. He used social media to target young women in precarious situations. He created fake profiles, sometimes as an attractive young man, sometimes as a police officer, often under female names. He particularly liked to use the profile of a supposed woman named Haida Mitzi. Under this name, he posted tempting job offers in Facebook groups, escort services, courier jobs, promotional work, all with the promise of quick money. His preferred hunting ground was La Paz, and especially his hometown of El Alto, where many people live in poverty, and young women are often forced to respond to any opportunity that comes their way. The scam was perfidious. As soon as a woman responded, Richard arranged a personal meeting. There was no job opportunity waiting for her, just a prepared ambush. The tactic he used to lure them into the trap was particularly perfidious. In some cases, he pretended to be conducting a police raid. He deliberately placed substances in a room he had rented beforehand, then showed up in a police uniform and threatened the women with arrest unless they cooperated. In his vocabulary, cooperation meant sexual violence, blackmail, video recordings, and ransom demands to the victims' families. On May 17, 2021, 17-year-old Lucy Maya Ramirez disappeared. She had previously responded to an offer on a Facebook group, apparently posted by Haida Mitzi. Her mother received a message the next day, $70,000 ransom or her daughter would die. The message contained explicit images that made it clear how serious the threat was. The family had no way of raising such a sum. Just 3 months later, on August 27, 2021, history repeated itself. 15-year-old Iris Malin Wilka disappeared under similar circumstances. Again, a ransom demand was received, again for $70,000, again accompanied by images. Meanwhile, other women also contacted the police. They reported that a man had deceived them on social media, then abused and threatened them. But for a long time, no one realized that a single perpetrator was behind all these cases, the same man who should have been in prison long ago. It was not until early 2022 that the investigation began to gain momentum. A 43-year-old woman reported to the police that she had been attacked by a man who had offered her a job on Facebook. She managed to escape and reported the man to the police. This statement provided the decisive breakthrough. The police arrested Richard Choca Flores in a hotel on January 24, 2022. But what followed shook not only Bolivia. It was the beginning of a scandal that called an entire justice system into question. After Richard Choca Flores was arrested on January 24, 2022, investigators immediately searched his home in El Alto. What they found there was beyond imagination. In a hidden area of the garden, they came across 2 shallow graves. In one of them, they discovered the body of Lucy Maya Ramirez, and in the other, the remains of Iris Malin Wilka. Both girls had been bound, abused, and wrapped in sacks. For the families, it was the gruesome confirmation of their worst fears, and for the investigators, a shock that shook the entire country. But that wasn't all. As they continued to search the house, they came across something that had been considered unsolved for years. The disappearance of Fidel, Richard's cousin, who had left in 2011 with the dream of studying at a military academy. Investigators found his skeleton under a thin layer of earth, buried in the same garden, just a few meters away from the girls. He had remained silent for 11 years, while his aunt desperately searched for answers. Now she had the bitter certainty: her nephew had killed her son. These findings surpassed all previous assumptions, but there were more victims than just these 3. The police discovered dozens of copies of ID cards, personal belongings of women, and even clothing that had apparently been kept as trophies in Richard's house. Over the next few weeks, the authorities received more than 70 reports from women who claimed to have been harassed, threatened, raped, or blackmailed by Richard. The number of unreported cases could be even higher. Many of those affected had remained silent for fear of reprisals. But now the silence had been broken. The system that should have stopped him had instead let him back on the streets, and there he had continued, more ruthless, more deliberate, more calculating. It was now clear that the case of Richard Choca Flores was more than an isolated incident. He was a symbol of a failed justice system that had made itself complicit through corruption and indifference. How was it possible that a murderer sentenced to life imprisonment was released even though there was no medical necessity? The answer was as shocking as the crimes themselves, and it would come to light in the next phase of the investigation. The answer to the question of why a convicted murderer like Richard Choca Flores was released early did not take long to emerge, and it shook Bolivia to its core. The investigation revealed that Richard's lawyers had filed a momentous motion with the court on December 21, 2019. They claimed that their client was seriously ill and could not survive under prison conditions. As proof, they submitted a medical certificate issued by Dr. Freddie Tim. It listed a number of diagnoses: hepatomegaly, gastritis, diabetes, allergies, asthma, and even the risk of stomach cancer. It was a catalog of ailments that was hardly verified, but it did exactly what the defense intended. It provided the legal basis for early release on health grounds. 3 days later, on December 24, 2019, Judge Rafael Alcon ruled in Richard's favor, but not out of compassion or conviction, but in exchange for a payment of $3,500 and a bottle of whiskey. The judge had been bought, and with his signature, he once again opened the door to freedom for the monster of El Alto. Richard Choque returned to his childhood home, to his mother and sister, who either had no idea what was going on or were willing to look the other way. What followed was a second wave of horror. Instead of keeping quiet as a man who had narrowly escaped death in prison would have done, Richard immediately resumed his old ways, even more cunning, even more ruthless. What no one knew was that Richard had long since compiled a new list of potential victims, a list that included girls who had never responded to him and who only survived by chance. But his luck ran out when one of his victims decided not to remain silent. And that was the beginning of the end. Photos of the girls he had abused circulated on social media, accompanied by hashtags such as Justicia para Lucy, Justice for Lucy, Ni una menos, Not one less, and El Alto no olvida, El Alto does not forget. Thousands shared their anger, their grief, and their questions. Why was this man free? Who had released him? And who was responsible for the price that so many girls had paid with their lives? On January 31, 2022, thousands of women marched through the streets of La Paz and El Alto. They carried photos of the victims and posters reading, "You let him go for money, and our lives are worth more." The protests spread to other cities. In Cochabamba, Santa Cruz, Oruro, it was more than anger. It was a revolt against a system that ignored poverty, inequality, and female voices. But it wasn't just the justice system that came under fire. In the days following the arrest, anger was also directed at the perpetrator's family. After his release, Richard had moved in with his mother and sister. These two women had lived with him all this time and kept silent. Neighbors reported hearing suspicious noises repeatedly, packages being delivered and taken away, girls entering the house, and never coming out again. When it was confirmed that the mother and sister were highly likely to have been accomplices, angry riots broke out. The family's house in El Alto was smeared with red paint and the word "complices," accomplices. Windows were smashed. The police had to secure the building and eventually arrest the two women themselves. What remained was a nation in shock, but no longer silent. Women's organizations, lawyers, journalists, and politicians demanded decisive judicial reform. It was unacceptable that a serial killer could remain free thanks to corrupt networks. The judge who abused his power to make this possible was finally removed from office.